Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 7, The Ghost's Walk. It is still wet weather down at the place in Lincolnshire. The rain is ever falling, drip, 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 by day and night upon the broad flagged terrace pavement, the Ghost's Walk. The weather is so very bad that the liveliest imagination can scarcely apprehend its ever being fine again. Not that there is any superabundant life of imagination on the spot, for Sir Leicester is not here, but is in Paris with my lady, and solitude sits brooding upon Chesney Wold. There may be some motions of fancy among the lower animals at Chesney Wold. The horses in the stables may contemplate some mental picture of fine weather on occasion, and may be better artists at them than the grooms. So with the dogs in the kennel buildings across the park, who have their restless fits, and whose doleful voices, when the wind has been very obstinate, have even made it known in the house itself, upstairs, downstairs, and in my lady's chamber. They may hunt the whole countryside while the raindrops are pattering round their inactivity. It has rained so hard and rained so long down in Lincolnshire that Mrs. Rouncewell, the old housekeeper at Chesney Wold, has several times taken off her spectacles and cleaned them to make certain that the drops were not upon the glasses. She is rather deaf, which nothing will induce her to believe. She is a fine old lady, handsome, stately, wonderfully neat, and has such a back and such a stomacher that if she stays her turn out when she dies, to have been a broad old-fashioned family fire grate, nobody who knows her would have cause to be surprised. Weather affects Mrs. Rouncewell little. The house is there in all weathers, and the house, as she expresses it, is what she looks at. She sits in her room, and the whole house reposes on her mind. It is shut up now, and lies on the breadth of Mrs. Rouncewell's iron-bound bosom, in a majestic sleep. The present representative of the Dedlocks is an excellent master. He supposes all his dependents to be utterly bereft of individual character, intentions, or opinions, and is persuaded that he was born to supersede the necessity of their having any. If he were to make a discovery on the contrary, he would be simply stunned, would never recover himself most likely, except to gasp and die. But he is an excellent master still, holding it a part of his state to be so. He has a great liking for Mrs. Rouncewell. He says she is a most respectable, credible woman. He always shakes hands with her when he comes down to Chesney Wold. And when he goes away, and if he were ill, or if he were knocked down by accident, or run over, or placed in any situation expressive of a deadlock at a disadvantage, he would say, if he could speak, "Leave me and send Mrs. Rouncewell here," feeling his dignity at such a pass, safer with her than with anybody else. Mrs. Rouncewell has known trouble. She has had 2 sons, of whom the younger ran wild and went for a soldier and never came back. Even at this hour, Mrs. Rouncewell's calm hands lose their composure when she speaks of him, as she says what a likely lad, what a fine lad, what a gay, good-humored, clever lad he was. Her second son would have been provided for at Chesney Wold, and would have made steward in due season, but he took, when he was a schoolboy, to constructing steam engines out of saucepans, and setting birds to draw their own water. This propensity gave Mrs. Rouncewell great uneasiness, but the doomed young rebel, otherwise a mild youth and very persevering, showed no sign of grace as he got older, but on the contrary, constructing a model of a power loom, she was fain, with many tears, to mention his backsliding to the baronet. "Mrs. Rouncewell," said Sir Leicester, "I could never consent to argue, as you know, with anyone on any subject. You had better get rid of your boy. You had better get him into some works. The iron country, farther north, is, I suppose, the congenial direction for a boy with these tendencies. Farther north he went, and farther north he grew up, and if Sir Leicester Dedlock ever thought of him afterwards, it is certain that he only regarded him as one of a body of some odd thousand conspirators, swarthy and grim, who are in the habit of turning out by torchlight 2 or 3 nights in a week for unlawful purposes. Nevertheless, Mrs. Rouncewell's son has, in the course of nature and art, grown up and established himself, and married and called unto him Mrs. Rouncewell's grandson, who stands leaning against the chimney-piece this very day in Mrs. Rouncewell's room at Chesney Wold. And again I am glad to see you, Wat, says Mrs. Rouncewell. You are a fine young fellow. You are like your poor Uncle George. Ah, Mrs. Rouncewell's hands unquiet as usual on this reference. They say I am like my father, grandmother. Like him also, dear, but most like your poor Uncle George. And your dear father, Miss Rouncewell folds her hands again. Is he well? Thriving, grandmother, in every way. Is he quite happy, says she. Quite. I am thankful. So he has brought you up to follow in his ways. Well, he knows best. There may be a world beyond Chesney Wold that I don't understand, though I am not young either, and I have seen a quantity of good company too. Grandmother, says the young man, changing the subject, what a very pretty girl that I found with you just now. You called her Rosa? Yes, child. She is a daughter of a widow in the village. Maids are so hard to teach nowadays that I have put her about me young. She's an apt scholar, and will do well. She shows the house already, very pretty. She lives with me at my table here. I hope I have not driven her away. She supposes we have family affairs to speak about, I dare say. She is very modest. It is a fine quality in a young woman, and scarcer, says Mrs. Rouncewell, than it formerly was. The young man inclines his head in acknowledgment of the precepts of experience. Mrs. Rouncewell listens. Wheels, says she. They have long been audible to the younger ears of her companion. What wheels on such a day as this, for gracious sake? After a short interval, a tap at the door. Come in. A dark-eyed, dark-haired, shy village beauty comes in, so fresh in her rosy and yet delicate bloom that the drops of rain, which have beaten on her hair, look like the dew upon a flower fresh gathered. What company is this, Rosa? Says Mrs. Rouncewell. It's 2 young men in a gig, ma'am, who want to see the house, and if you please, I told them so, in reply to a gesture of dissent from the housekeeper. I told them it was the wrong day and the wrong hour, but the young man who was driving took off his hat and begged me to bring this card to you. Read it, my dear Wat, says the housekeeper. Mr. Guppy is the information the card yields. Guppy, repeated Mrs. Rouncewell. Mr. Guppy! Nonsense, I have never heard of him. If you please, he told me that, said Rosa. But he said that he and the other young gentleman came from London only last night by the mail on business at the magistrates' meeting 10 miles off this morning, and that as their business was soon over, they had heard a great deal said of Chesney Wold. They had come through the wet to see it. They are lawyers. He says he is not in Mr. Tulkinghorn's office, but he is sure he may make use of Mr. Tulkinghorn's name if necessary. Now, Mr. Tulkinghorn is, in a manner, part and parcel of the place, and besides, he is supposed to have made Mrs. Rouncewell's will. The old lady relaxes, consents to the admission of the visitors as a favor, and dismisses Rosa. The grandson, however, being smitten by a sudden wish to see the house himself, proposes to join the party. The grandmother accompanies him, though, to do him justice, he is exceedingly unwilling to trouble her. Much obliged to you, ma'am, says Mr. Guppy, divesting himself of the wet dreadnought in the hall. Of his wet dreadnought in the hall. Us London lawyers don't often get an out, and when we do, we like to make the most of it, you know. The old housekeeper, with a gracious severity of deportment, waves her hand toward the great staircase. Mr. Guppy and his friend follow Rosa. Mrs. Rouncewell and her grandson follow them. A young gardener goes before to open the shutters. As is usual the case with people who go over houses, Mr. Guppy and his friends are dead beat before they have well begun. They straggle about in the wrong places, look at wrong things, don't care for right things, gape when more rooms are open, exhibit profound depression of spirits, and are clearly knocked up. Thus they pass on from room to room, raising the pictured deadlocks for a few brief minutes as the young gardener admits the light, and, reconsigning them to their graves as he shuts it out again, it appears to the afflicted Mr. Guppy and his inconsolable friend that there is no end to the deadlocks, whose family greatness seems to consist in their never having done anything to distinguish themselves for 700 years. Even the long drawing-room of Chesney Wold cannot revive Mr. Guppy's spirits. He is so low that he droops on the threshold and has hardly strength of mind to enter. But a portrait over the chimney-piece, painted by a fashionable artist of the day, acts upon him like a charm. He recovers in a moment. He stares at it with uncommon interest. He seems to be fixed and fascinated by it. "Dear me," says Mr. Guppy, "who's that?" "The picture over the fireplace," says Rosa, "is the portrait of the present Lady Dedlock. It is considered a perfect likeness and the best work of the master." "Blessed," says Mr. Guppy, staring in a kind of dismay at his friend. "If I can ever have seen her, yet I know her. Has the picture been engraved, miss?" "The picture has never been engraved. Sir Leicester has always refused permission." "Well," says Mr. Guppy in a low voice, "I'll be shot if it ain't very curious how well I know that picture. So that's Lady Dedlock, it is." "It's unaccountable to me," he says, still staring at the portrait, "how well I know that picture. I'm dashed," adds Mr. Guppy, looking round, "if I don't think I must have had a dream of that picture, you know." As no one present takes a special interest in Mr. Guppy's dreams, the probability is not pursued, but he still remains so absorbed by the portrait that he stands immovable before it, and until the young gardener has closed the shutters, when he comes out of the room in a dazed state and follows into the succeeding rooms with a confused stare, as if he were looking everywhere for Lady Dedlock again, he sees no more of her. He sees her rooms, which are the last shown as being very elegant, and he looks out of the windows from which she looked out not long ago upon the weather that bored her to death. He has come to the end of the sight of the fresh village beauty, to the end of her description, which is always this: the terrace below is much admired. It is called, from an old story in the family, the Ghost's Walk. "No," says Mr. Guppy, greedily curious. "What's the story, miss? Is it anything about a picture?" "I don't know, sir." Rosa is shyer than ever. "It is not related to visitation." "It is not related to it is not related to visitors. It is almost forgotten," says the housekeeper, advancing. "It has never been more than a family anecdote." "You'll excuse my asking again if it has anything to do with a picture, ma'am," observed Mr. Guppy, "because I do assure you that the more I think of that picture, the better I know it without knowing how I know it." The story has nothing to do with the picture, the housekeeper can guarantee that. Mr. Guppy retires with his friend, and presently is heard to drive away. It is now dusk. Mrs. Rouncewell can trust to the discretion of her two young hearers, and may tell them how the terrace came to have that ghostly name. She seats herself in a large chair by the fast-darkening window, and tells them, "In the wicked days, my dears, of King Charles I mean, of course, in the wicked days of the rebels who leagued themselves against that excellent king, Sir Morbury Dedlock was the owner of Chesney Wold. Whether there was any account of a ghost in the family before those days, I can't say. Sir Morbury Dedlock," says Mrs. Rouncewell, "was, I have no occasion to say, on the side of the blessed martyr, but it is supposed that his lady, who had none of the family blood in her veins, favoured the bad cause. It is said that she had relations among King Charles's enemies, and that she gave them information. When any of the country gentlemen who followed his majesty's cause met here, it is said that my lady was always nearer to the door of their council room than they supposed. Do you hear a sound like a footstep passing along the terrace, Wat? Rosa draws nearer to the housekeeper. I hear the rain drip in the stones, says the young. I hear the rain drip in the stones, replies the young man, and I hear a curious echo, I suppose, an echo which is very like a halting step. The housekeeper gravely nods and continues, partly on account of this division between them, and partly on other accounts. Sir Morbury and his lady led a troubled life. She was a lady of a haughty temper. They were well suited to each other in an age or They were not well suited to each other in age or character, and they had no children to moderate between them. After her favourite brother, a young gentleman, was killed in the Civil War by Sir Morbury's near kinsman, her feeling was so violent that she hated the race into which she had married. When the Deadlocks were about to ride out from Chesney Wold, in the king's cause, she was supposed to have more than once stolen down into the stables in the dead of night and lamed their horses. And the story is that once her husband saw her gliding down the stairs and followed her into the stall where his own favourite horse stood. There he seized her by the wrist, and in a struggle or in a fall, she was lamed in the hip, and from that hour began to pine away. The housekeeper had dropped her voice to a little more than a whisper. She had been a lady of a handsome figure and a noble carriage. She never complained of the change. She never spoke to anyone of being crippled or of being in pain. But day by day she tried to walk upon the terrace, and with the help of the stone balustrade went up and down in sun and shadow, with greater difficulty every day. At last, one afternoon, her husband, to whom she had never on any persuasion opened her lips since that night, standing in the great south window, saw her drop upon the pavement. He hastened down to raise her, but she repulsed him as he bent over her, and looking at him fixedly and coldly said, I will die here where I have walked, and I will walk here though I am in my grave. I will walk here until the pride of this house is humbled. And when calamity or when disgrace is coming to it, let the Deadlocks listen for my step. There and then she died, and from those days, says Mrs. Rouncewell, the name has come down, the Ghost's Walk. If the tread is an echo, it is an echo that is only heard after dark, and is often unheard for a long while together, but it comes back from time to time. And so sure is there a sickness, and so sure as there is a sickness or death in the family, it will be heard then. And disgrace, grandmother, says Wat. Disgrace never comes to Chesney Wold, returns the housekeeper. Her grandson apologizes. True, that is the story. Whatever the sound is, it is a worrying sound, says Mrs. Rouncewell, getting up for her chair. And what is to be noticed in it is that it must be heard. My lady, who is afraid of nothing, admits that when it is there, it must be heard. You cannot shut it out, so my lady says. And that is the end of chapter 7.